You can feel it, even if you haven't found the words for it yet. Something in your life no longer fits the way it used to. The places are the same, the people may still be there, the routines may still continue, but something inside you has quietly stepped back from it all. What once felt normal now feels strangely distant, almost like you're watching your old life from behind invisible glass. And this is where most people panic. Not because everything is falling apart, but because they don't understand what is really ending. They think they're losing control, losing direction, losing themselves. But what if the collapse you're afraid of is not a punishment, not a failure, not a mistake, but the first sign that your consciousness has outgrown the reality built around your old self? At first, nothing dramatic happens. The sky doesn't split open. No voice tells you that your life is changing. Everything around you appears almost insultingly normal. The same streets, the same rooms, the same messages, the same obligations. And yet, something inside you begins to notice a quiet wrongness beneath the surface of ordinary life. It may begin in the smallest moments. You wake up and feel a strange resistance before the day even starts. You look at your phone and feel tired before you've answered anyone. You sit in a familiar place, surrounded by familiar faces, and suddenly feel as though some invisible thread has loosened. You're there, but not fully there. Present, but no longer absorbed. This is one of the first hidden truths of inner change. Reality rarely collapses all at once. It begins by losing its emotional authority over you. The life that once defined you still exists, but it no longer convinces you in the same way. The routines continue, but the meaning behind them begins to fade. What once felt necessary starts to feel strangely theatrical. This is the moment when an old identity begins to separate from your awareness. The part of you that was trained to function, please, perform, survive, and belong, is still moving through the world, but another part of you is watching it. And that watcher is dangerous to the old life. Because once you start seeing the pattern, you can't completely disappear back into it. You may even feel guilty for this distance. You may wonder why you're not grateful, why you feel restless, why you can't enjoy what used to comfort you. But the emotional realization is simple and unsettling. You're not becoming cold. You're becoming conscious of where you've been asleep. And consciousness often feels like loneliness at first, because it separates you from the illusions you used to share with everyone else. The crack appears when you realize the world hasn't changed, but your relationship to it has. Something in you has moved beyond the version of life that once held you in place. And once the familiar begins to feel unfamiliar, the next mystery rises quietly. Why does the old life not only lose meaning, but begin to push you away? There comes a point when the old life doesn't merely feel empty. It begins to feel hostile to your becoming. The job that once seemed manageable starts draining something deeper than energy. The conversations you used to tolerate now feel strangely heavy. The habits you once escaped into no longer soothe you. Even certain rooms, certain streets, certain voices begin to feel like they belong to someone you are no longer becoming. This can make you think something is wrong with you. You may tell yourself you're being too sensitive, too restless, too difficult, too ungrateful. But the hidden mechanism is not failure. It is incompatibility. Your outer life was built around an older version of your inner world. When that inner world changes, everything arranged around the old version begins to create friction. A relationship can look the same and still no longer meet you. A goal can still be impressive and no longer feel alive. A place can still be safe and no longer feel true. This is the strange cruelty of transformation. Things don't have to be bad in order to be finished. Sometimes they simply belong to a consciousness you have already outgrown. The psychological insight is that the nervous system often clings to familiarity, even when the soul is starving inside it. The mind says, stay where it's predictable. The deeper self says, you cannot keep shrinking here. And between those two voices, tension forms. That tension is what many people mistake for anxiety, confusion, or personal failure, when it may actually be the pressure of an old structure losing its power over you. This is why certain environments suddenly feel unbearable. Not because they have changed, but because they still expect you to play a role you can no longer inhabit without betraying yourself. The old life recognizes you only when you are smaller, quieter, more available, more afraid, more obedient to the identity it helped create. When you stop feeding that version, the system around it begins to react. And this is where the rejection becomes meaningful. The closed door, the fading connection, the sudden exhaustion, the strange discomfort in familiar places may not be life punishing you. It may be life refusing to let you remain inside a reality that can no longer hold your consciousness. But when the old anchors begin to disappear, something ancient in the mind panics, because it cannot tell the difference between transformation and destruction. The panic does not always arrive as a dramatic breakdown. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet urgency in the chest, a strange pressure behind your thoughts, a feeling that you need to fix everything immediately before your whole life slips out of your hands. You may start questioning every decision, every relationship, every path you once trusted, not because you suddenly know what is wrong, but because something inside you can no longer pretend that everything is right. This is the stage where most people run back. They return to the old habit, the old person, the old distraction, the old version of themselves that at least felt recognizable. They don't go back because it was peaceful. They go back because it was familiar. And the ego will often choose familiar pain over unfamiliar freedom, because familiar pain still gives it a map. The hidden truth is that panic often appears at the doorway of awakening because the mind believes it is dying. It feels the old identity losing control, and it translates that loss as danger. The ego does not understand transformation. It understands repetition, protection, prediction, and survival. So when life begins removing the anchors that once defined you, the mind screams, something is going wrong, when something deeper may be going right. Psychologically, this is the fear of losing the structure that told you who you were. Your routines gave you continuity. Your roles gave you recognition. Your relationships reflected a certain image back to you. Your ambitions gave your future a familiar shape. When these begin to dissolve, you are not only losing circumstances, you are losing the mirror that confirmed the old self. And that is why this moment feels so intimate. It is not simply fear of change. It is fear of becoming someone you cannot yet explain. You may feel pulled towards silence, distance, solitude, or a new truth you cannot defend logically. And because you cannot prove it to anyone, you may start doubting yourself. But the emotional realization is this: the part of you that is panicking is not the part of you that is awakening. The panic is guarding a door it cannot see beyond. It wants to drag you back into the life that was quietly suffocating you, because suffocation at least had a name, a schedule, a role, a pattern. But something in you has already crossed an invisible line. And once that line is crossed, the question is no longer how to save the old self, but what part of you was never real to begin with. The false self does not die easily, because for a long time it protected you. It learned what made people approve of you. It learned which emotions to hide, which desires to silence, which dreams to postpone, which parts of your truth made others uncomfortable. It became the version of you that could survive in rooms where your real self did not yet feel safe enough to breathe. This is why its collapse can feel confusing. You may feel grief for a life you no longer want. You may miss people you no longer resonate with. You may feel attached to goals that no longer inspire you, simply because they once gave you an identity. The mind asks, why am I sad if this was never truly me? But the heart understands something deeper. Even a mask can become familiar after you have worn it for years. The hidden truth is that what is ending is not your essence. It is the arrangement of defenses, expectations, fears, and inherited beliefs that you once mistook for yourself. The false self is built from survival. It says yes when it wants to say no. It smiles when it feels unseen. It performs strength when it is exhausted. It becomes useful, acceptable, impressive, agreeable, and quietly loses contact with what is true. This is the moment when the personality begins to separate from the soul. Not in a dramatic or mystical way, but in ordinary moments of unbearable honesty. You hear yourself agree to something, and a deeper part of you recoils. You tell the same story about your life, and suddenly it sounds hollow. You look at the person you have been trying to become, and realize you never actually chose them. You inherited them. That realization can feel like loss, but it is also the beginning of freedom. Because when the false self starts to fall away, you may discover emotions you buried, desires you dismissed, anger you called weakness, tenderness you called danger, intuition you called imagination. The old identity called these things inconvenient. The deeper self recognizes them as fragments of your original life returning. And yet, when the mask begins to dissolve, there is often nothing immediately waiting underneath that feels solid. This is the part nobody warns you about. You don't instantly become clear, powerful, and certain. You may become quiet, empty, unnamed, suspended between who you were pretending to be and who you have not yet become. And in that emptiness, the real test begins. The emptiness arrives quietly, and this is why it can frighten you more than chaos. When things are falling apart, at least there is movement. There is something to fix, something to explain, something to blame. But after the first collapse, there may come a strange silence where nothing old feels alive, and nothing new has fully appeared. You are not who you were, but you are not yet who you are becoming. This is the space where many people make decisions too quickly. They reach for an old relationship, an old identity, an old distraction, not because it is right, but because it gives shape to the void. They would rather return to a familiar cage than sit inside an unknown freedom. And the hidden truth is that emptiness is often mistaken for abandonment, when it may actually be the first sacred room you have ever entered without a mask. The mind hates this stage because it has no role to perform. It cannot impress the void. It cannot negotiate with silence. It cannot prove its worth to something that does not ask for performance. So it begins offering you urgent solutions. Text someone, chase something, rebuild quickly, become useful again. But the deeper self does not speak in panic. It waits until the noise of the old identity stops echoing. You may notice that your desires become unclear. The things you once wanted feel strangely distant, but you don't yet know what has replaced them. This can make you feel lost, but something more subtle is happening. You are being separated from desires that were never truly yours. Some ambitions were built from comparison. Some attachments were built from fear. Some dreams were inherited from people who never asked who you really were. The emotional realization is that the void is not empty because you have nothing left. It is empty because what was false has been removed before what is true has taken form. This is why it feels so delicate. You are standing in the space between identities, where every old impulse is tested. Will you run back to what wounded you just because it has a name? Will you confuse silence with rejection? Will you mistake stillness for failure? And if you stay long enough, the emptiness begins to change texture. It stops feeling like a punishment and begins to feel like a threshold. You start sensing that not everything absent has been lost. Some things have been cleared. Some doors have closed because they were leading you back into sleep. But then another strange thing begins to happen. The world starts sending small signs that you are no longer standing in the same reality. When you are between two realities, life begins to feel symbolic in ways you cannot easily explain. A song appears at the exact moment you needed to hear it. A number repeats until it feels less like coincidence and more like a quiet knock on the walls of your attention. A conversation mentions the very thing you were thinking about in silence. Nothing is loud enough to prove anything, but everything feels too precise to ignore. This is not about forcing meaning onto every little event. It is about noticing that your perception has become more sensitive. The hidden truth is that transition sharpens the symbolic mind. When the old identity is no longer absorbing all your energy, you begin to see patterns you once walked past. reality did not necessarily become more mysterious. You became less numb to its mystery. This can happen when your inner world is reorganizing itself. Dreams become vivid because the unconscious is speaking in images before your waking mind has language. Old memories return because they are connected to parts of you being released. Sudden clarity appears in the middle of ordinary moments because your mind is no longer fully loyal to the old story. You begin understanding things without knowing exactly how you know. You may also feel detached from places, people, and goals that once pulled you strongly. Not in a cold way, but in a clean way. As if some emotional cord has been loosened. You may walk through your usual world and feel as though you are visiting a life that still recognizes your face, but no longer knows your soul. This is one of the strangest signs. Being in the world, but not fully inside the version of it that once held you. Then come the endings. Plans change without warning. People drift. Invitations disappear. Delays protect you from paths you thought you wanted. Things you tried to force refuse to open, while unexpected doors appear almost quietly, without spectacle. The emotional realization is difficult but freeing. Not every disruption is an obstacle. Some disruptions are the intelligence of transition rearranging your life before your conscious mind understands why. And yet, the most revealing sign is not the number, the dream, the coincidence, or the sudden ending. It is the way your inner reaction changes. You no longer want to betray yourself just to keep things stable. You no longer feel the same hunger to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. And once that shift begins, certain connections cannot survive it, because they were never connected to the person you are becoming. One of the most painful parts of this collapse is realizing that not everyone who walked with you was walking toward the same version of you. Some people were connected to your old rhythm, your old wounds, your old availability, your old silence. They knew how to relate to the self that explained, apologized, overgave, tolerated, and kept certain truths hidden to preserve the bond. But when that version begins to disappear, the relationship can suddenly lose its familiar language. At first, you may try to hold on. You may try to explain what is happening inside you, hoping they will understand the shift. But there are people who can only recognize you when you remain inside the role they assign to you. The moment you become less predictable, less easily accessed, less willing to betray your inner knowing, something in them becomes uncomfortable. They may call you distant, selfish, strange, cold, or changed, without realizing that change is exactly what your soul has been asking for. The hidden truth is that some relationships are not built around love, but around an unconscious agreement. You remain who they need you to be, and they remain who your old wound expects them to be. One person plays rescuer, one plays abandoned, one plays teacher, one plays child. One gives too much. One receives without seeing. These agreements can feel like destiny until consciousness enters the room and breaks the spell. This is where projection begins to dissolve. You stop seeing certain people as the answer to your emptiness, the proof of your worth, the missing piece of your story. And they stop being able to project the old image onto you without resistance. This can feel like betrayal, but sometimes it is simply revelation. You are not losing the person as much as losing the illusion that held the connection together. The emotional realization is quiet and heavy. Some people were not meant to cross the threshold with you, not because they are evil, not because the connection meant nothing, but because they belonged to a chapter where you were still learning through attachment, longing, fear, or reflection. Their disappearance may hurt because they touch something real in you, but that does not mean they are meant to remain in the reality your deeper self is entering. And this is where the collapse becomes strangely sacred. The empty chair, the unanswered message, the friendship that fades, the love that no longer knows how to reach you, all of it begins to reveal who was connected to your essence and who was connected to your mask. But if people can disappear because your inner world has changed, then perhaps this has happened before, in every age, under different names. And perhaps your personal collapse belongs to a much older pattern. Long before modern life gave names to anxiety, identity crisis, burnout, or emotional transition, ancient cultures understood something we have almost forgotten. A person cannot enter a deeper life without first being removed from the old one. In myths, rites of passage, mystery schools, and shamanic traditions, transformation rarely begins with comfort. It begins with separation. The initiate leaves the village, descends into darkness, loses a familiar name, and returns only after something false has died. This is not just a story from the past. It is a pattern still moving quietly beneath human experience. You may not be taken into a temple or guided through a ritual under the stars, but life itself may begin performing the ceremony. The job ends. The relationship changes. The old ambition becomes tasteless. The familiar world grows thin. You are pulled away from the noise, not because you are being abandoned, but because initiation often begins by making ordinary life impossible to continue unconsciously. The hidden truth is that collapse has always been part of awakening, because the old self cannot be gently persuaded to leave. It has to lose its throne. It has to discover that its strategies no longer work. It has to reach the edge of its own map and realize there is no way forward using the same identity that brought it there. This is why the process feels so frightening. You are not simply improving your life. You are passing through a symbolic death. Psychologically, this death is the dismantling of the personality structure that once organized your reality. The roles, the defenses, the attachments, the fears, the ambitions, the inherited beliefs, all of them formed a world around you. And when that structure dissolves, it can feel as though reality itself is dissolving. But what is really dissolving is the version of reality that could only exist while you remained asleep to your own depth. Ancient wisdom understood that the void was not failure. It was the chamber between death and rebirth. The place where the old name no longer answers and the new name has not yet been spoken. This is why you may feel stripped, uncertain, invisible, or suspended. You are not being erased. You are being emptied of what cannot pass through the threshold. And every true initiation asks the same silent question. Are you willing to stop being who you were praised for being? But initiation does not end in darkness. It ends when perception changes. Not when the world suddenly becomes perfect, not when every problem disappears, not when a grand sign descends from the sky. The new reality begins much more quietly than that. It begins in the moment you can no longer betray yourself and call it peace. It begins when silence no longer feels empty, but alive with instructions you are only beginning to hear. The new reality does not usually announce itself with thunder. It does not arrive as a perfect plan, a sudden miracle, or a life where every uncertainty disappears. More often, it begins so quietly that you almost miss it. A different desire appears. A boundary forms without guilt. A truth rises in your chest, and this time, you do not push it back down just to keep the old world comfortable. At first, the change may look invisible from the outside. People may think you are simply more distant, more serious, more selective, more difficult to reach. But inside, something profound has shifted. You no longer feel the same hunger to explain yourself. You no longer chase every door that closes. You no longer confuse intensity with connection, or exhaustion with loyalty, or self-abandonment with love. The hidden truth is that the new life begins before the new circumstances appear. It begins as a change in perception. You see the same situation, but your body gives you a different answer. You hear the same promise, but your intuition no longer believes it. You stand before the same temptation, the same pattern, the same familiar escape, and something deeper in you whispers, "Not this time." This is the birth of a new inner authority. For years, you may have organized your life around approval, urgency, fear, expectation, or the need to be understood. But now a quieter intelligence begins to guide you. It does not shout. It does not argue. It simply makes betrayal feel impossible. Not because you have become hard, but because you have finally begun to belong to yourself. This is why solitude may feel different now. Before, Being alone may have felt like punishment, rejection, or proof that something was missing. But now silence begins to feel like a place where your real self can gather strength. You may still feel uncertain. You may still have questions. But beneath the uncertainty, there is a strange calm, as if some deeper part of you already knows that the old life had to end for this presence to return. And then, slowly, reality starts responding to the person you are becoming. Not always quickly, not always in ways your mind expected, but through cleaner choices, clearer endings, unexpected openings, deeper instincts, and a life that no longer requires you to abandon yourself in order to belong. You are not rebuilding what collapsed. You are becoming someone who can enter a reality the old self would never have recognized. And maybe now you can see it more clearly. What looked like loss was not only loss. What looked like confusion was not only confusion. What looked like life falling apart may have been the moment your old reality could no longer hold the person you were becoming. The people who drifted away, the desires that went silent, the routines that lost their meaning, the strange emptiness, the sudden clarity, the quiet signs, the feeling that you were standing between two worlds, none of it was random. It was the language of transition. A deeper part of you was trying to separate you from a life that could only continue if you kept abandoning yourself. And this is why most people panic here. They think the ending means they have failed. But sometimes the ending is the first honest thing that has happened in years. Sometimes the silence after collapse is not punishment. It is the place where your real self begins to speak again. So if your old life feels like it is ending, don't rush to rebuild the prison just because it was familiar. Let the false structures fall. Let the mask lose its power. Let the emptiness teach you what noise never could. You are not disappearing. You are returning to yourself in a form your old reality could never recognize. And if this message reached you at the exact moment you needed it, maybe that is part of the pattern too. Like this video if it spoke to something you've been feeling. And subscribe if you want to keep walking through these hidden layers of awakening, meaning, and inner transformation. And before you leave, write one word in the comments: threshold. Not as a statement to anyone else, but as a quiet sign to yourself that you understand where you are now. You are not at the end of your life. You are standing at the edge of the one that can finally begin.